Today is December 5th, and it's 3 p.m. Eastern Time, so it's time for our study of moral philosophy. We're going to study Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which is a classic textbook on moral philosophy. It teaches us everything we need to know about morals, about true moral philosophy, and ethics is just another name for moral philosophy. So we're going to read through, study together, and talk about Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. That's how you pronounce that word, Nicomachean. I'm not sure why it's called Nicomachean. Nicomachus is the name of Aristotle's father. So it could be named after his father, but it's also the name of his son. His son was also Nicomachus, so it could be named after his son. There are two Nicomachuses in Aristotle's life. I'm sure someone knows whether it was named after the son or the father, but I don't know that off the top of my head. But anyway, that word is pronounced Nicomachean, and it just refers to the name of either Aristotle's father or son. All right, and then ethics is just another name for moral philosophy. So we're going to study the philosophy or the science of morals, right? We're going to study the science of morals. Lara, I'm going to ignore that for now. It's a good question though. So the science of morals. So everybody has a general sense of morals, right? Everybody has a general sense of what's right and wrong. We have this idea of the golden rule kind of implanted in our soul. Even if you're not taught morals, even when you're a little kid, 2 years old, I don't know if any of you have younger siblings, but you can be 2, 3 years old, 4 years old. You already have a sense of right and wrong. You already have a sense of justice. Kids throw tantrums when they feel like they're not getting what they deserve. We all get angry when people do things to us that are unjust, even if we've never studied morals. People just living in the world will get upset about injustices. So we've all got this sense of morality, but our ideas of morality can be false. We can have ideas that are actually not true. And if we don't understand morals in a really clear scientific way, we just can't progress personally because we're hindered by wrong ideas about how we should behave and how we should act and what's right and wrong. We don't know what to do in certain circumstances. That makes us uncomfortable. We feel nervous. We feel shy. We're confused. When we learn morals scientifically, it makes it clear what's right and wrong and helps us to live confidently, make good decisions, and so on. It's easy to figure out what our duty is when we know how we're supposed to act. So for example, if there's a house on fire and someone's standing outside and they push you and they say, go in there and save somebody, is it your duty to go inside a burning house and save somebody? Let's say one of your grandparents, God forbid, it comes to the end of their life, and there's question about whether we should put them on life support and keep them on life support, or pay for them to go into some kind of really expensive care. Do we have a moral obligation to pay for someone to be on life support, thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars a day? We get into all these issues in life where we've got really serious moral decisions to make. And if you don't have a scientific knowledge of morality, it just becomes ignorance and emotion that leads people to make these decisions. And so we've got to know these things. We've got to know what our duties really are, how to be happy, what we need to do to be happy, and so on. And that comes through the study of moral philosophy. So we're going to read Aristotle's Ethics together, and he's going to teach us this whole science. So we're not going to be confused for long, but the book starts with some boring, they're boring. These first few chapters, it's like general philosophical stuff that we've got to get through. It's important, but it can be boring, especially if you're reading it by yourself. It's hard to get through. But I'll explain it, and then we'll eventually get to the lessons where he starts talking about all the different virtues and vices, which are basically good habits and bad habits. And he'll explain exactly what they are, and it'll be really helpful because it'll help you to think about your own life and understand your own behavior and improve yourself. motivate you to live well. I know for my own kids, my older kids, if you were to ask them, think about all the stuff that they study as my kids being home with us and stuff. If you were to ask them, which were your favorite courses? What was the most important course you ever studied? They would all say this ethics course. This is always the favorite course, the most influential course, the course that changes their lives. And they would all say this ethics course is the best. So I want to share my screen and then we'll get started reading this. But like I said, the first few lessons are a little boring because we go through some introductory stuff. But then we're going to get through that and it won't be so boring. It actually gets very practical and helpful. Just ignore this stuff on the screen. That's just, because I'm the admin for the website, you can see some controls and stuff like that. Just ignore that. All right. So anyway, Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 1. And so this is a very short chapter. If you look, that's it right there. It's just 2 paragraphs, very short, easy to read. But there are some ideas in here that are new that I'm going to explain and make really clear for you. So just follow me through here. Before we get into that, though, if you remember, I shared last week, I shared this document, an overview of philosophy, which is really important. We talked about philosophy being the love of wisdom, right? And wisdom is the perfection of reason, the desire to know order, the desire to order things. And there are different kinds of reason. And I said the third kind of order, I should say, not reason. The third kind of order is the one that we're working on in moral philosophy. It's order that is established through deliberation in the will. What in the world does that mean? It means that we order our will. We order the desires and the behavior of our life. We order our own soul so that we understand what we should do in any circumstance and practice doing it. So in moral philosophy, we're going to seek to establish order in our soul by controlling our will and bringing our desires into order. And we can only do that if we understand moral philosophy. So it's the third kind of order there that we study in moral philosophy. And down here, we can read what moral philosophy is. Moral philosophy considers the order of voluntary actions. What does voluntary mean? What do you think voluntary means? What does voluntary mean? Give me an answer. What does voluntary mean? Willing, good, right? Willing, okay? So if I tell you I want you to go rake the leaves and you kind of fuss and kind of squirm around a little bit, and I say, all right, I'll give you $20 if you go and rake the leaves, and then you go out and rake the leaves for $20. Are you doing that voluntarily? Are you doing that voluntarily? Not really, right? Yeah, not really. I mean, to a degree, because you could still say no, right? But it's not really voluntary. But it's got to do with your will. If I stick a rake in your hand and drag you out into the front yard and get a stick, and every time you stop raking, I whip you with the stick, is that voluntary work? That's not voluntary, right? If you're trying to run away and I decide to put handcuffs on you and chain you and tie you to the tree and make you rake leaves, that's not voluntary. So when we talk about voluntary actions, we mean things that we do voluntarily, our will, actions that we're actually responsible for. We're responsible for voluntary actions, okay? The actions of our own will is the concern of moral philosophy. And the same thing is true with involuntary actions. We often don't worry about them too much because, they're not in our control. And, there's different kinds of involuntary actions, but they're not in our control. And consequently, we're not morally responsible for them. For example, a hiccup is an action that takes place in my body, but it's involuntary. I don't intentionally hiccup, right? So if I accidentally hiccup in the middle of a class or something like that, I shouldn't get in trouble for something like that. Or if I sneeze and so on, those are involuntary actions. My heart is beating involuntarily. I'm not thinking about making sure I remember to make my heart beat every day. We have involuntary actions like that just take place naturally. They're instinctive and natural. But animals have all those same actions. Animals sneeze, animals cough, animals hearts beat, and so on. We share in those actions with animals. Those are not human actions. They're just animal actions. Human actions relate to the human will. They're things that we do that animals don't do. All right. Voluntary actions. Another way to think about involuntary actions are actions that are forced, right? Like if I put a gun to your head and demand that you do something or threaten to kill you, and then you do it, that's not a voluntary action. You could choose to make yourself a martyr and die for it, right? You could choose to do that. But when we do things under like terror or fear of losing our life or fear of torture or something like that, those are not considered to be voluntary actions. So you might not be held morally accountable for things like that. And this is true in the law as well. So for example, let's say there's a situation where there's adultery in a marriage, and one of the spouses commits adultery and the other spouse is just driven crazy with anger, and he does something like goes and attacks the other person and maybe kills them or beats them up or something like that. When that case goes to court, the court will consider all of the circumstances and will realize that that person was provoked to that behavior. It wasn't voluntary, it was provoked. And so the punishments for the punishment, even though it's still a crime, the punishment for a crime that's provoked will be much less than a crime that's not provoked. Like if there's an evil person who's sitting around planning to kill someone, that's called premeditated murder. That's punished more severely than a person who is provoked to anger or is threatened and responds and accidentally kills someone, or kills someone without wanting to kill them, but they felt like they were threatened or something like that. You'll see that all of these differences that we learn about in moral philosophy, they're all in the law. They're all in our laws. We can see them. Okay. There's different punishments. There's different names for different crimes. If a person, goes out into the driveway, gets in the car, puts the car in reverse and backs up, and just as they back up, a kid comes riding by on a bike and they back up and hit the child on the bike, and the child dies tragically, that's not murder, right? That could be manslaughter, or it could just be an accident. Courts have to decide all that stuff. They have to find out if it was intentional, if it could have been avoided, if it should have been avoided. So we see there's lots of complicated moral dilemmas in society. It's not very simple. So when we look at the 10 Commandments and we see something like thou shalt not kill, obviously it's not that simple, right? Because if someone breaks into my house and is threatening to hurt my family, I'm allowed to kill them. It's self-defense. So thou shalt not kill isn't that simple. If a police officer is trying to stop a crime and he can't control the criminal, he can pull out a gun and kill the criminal. That's not what it means, thou shalt not kill. If a soldier is sent to war and he's fighting in a battle and he kills someone, that's not what it means when the command says thou shalt not kill. So we get into all these complicated issues, and moral philosophy allows us to sort through all these things and understand exactly what's going on, what we should do, what we shouldn't do, what we're responsible for, what we're not responsible for, and so on. So you can see it's very, very practical and helpful to study these things. And that's why, like I said, even for my own kids, this was always the course that they felt changed their life and really helped them a lot. So we're going to study voluntary actions, or human actions, actions that come from the soul, right? They come from our will. They're not things that happen to us. They're not things we're forced to do. They're not things our bodies just do naturally. They're things that we actually choose to do. Those are the kinds of things we're talking about in ethics, okay? So when we come to chapter one, we're just going to get started and introduced to the subject here. Aristotle just introduces us. So he starts out, and I'm just going to go one sentence at a time, and I'll explain everything, because like I said, these first few chapters, they're a little confusing, a little boring, a little philosophical. We just have to get through them so we can get to the good stuff. All right. First sentence, Aristotle says, every art, every method, in like manner, every action and every deliberate choice appear to aspire after a certain good. Every art, every method, every action, every deliberate choice, they all appear to aspire after a certain good. So in this list of things, when he lists these things, these different things, arts, methods, actions, and deliberate choices, he's simply telling us different kinds of human actions, like I just said, right? Human actions, actions that actually come from the will. Arts, methods, that's another name for like science. Every action, every human action, every deliberate choice, every decision that you make after thinking about it. All of these things, we do these things because we're seeking some good. We're seeking something that we desire. There's something that we desire. We don't do things randomly. We don't do things for no reason. We do things willingly because there's something that we desire. There's some good that we desire. And note, when he says good, he doesn't mean that it's morally good. It could actually be bad. For example, a drug addict will get up in the morning and get himself dressed and walk out into the street because he wants drugs. That's what he wants. To him, the reason why he gets himself out of bed, gets dressed, and goes walking down the road, he does all of that voluntarily, is because he's seeking some good. And the good that he's seeking is what he desires. It's the drugs that he desires. So when we say good, we're not talking about moral good, like he wants to go and help the poor or he wants to go and feed the hungry. We're not talking about things that are good in and of themselves. We're talking about things that we seek because to us, we perceive them to be good. They're the things that we desire, all right? So they could be bad things, absolutely. They could be immoral things, but to the person who does them, they're considered to be good, okay? They're considered to be good. That's what he means by good here. All right. So if you've got a person who's like terribly obese and unhealthy, and they just keep eating and eating and eating, and you wonder, why do they do that? It's because they like it, right? It's because they desire to do it. They like the pleasure of food. To them, that's good. That's what he means by good. They do it intentionally. Okay. Every art, every method, every human action, every deliberate choice everything that's done willingly by men appears to aspire after some good. Hence, it is well said that the good is that which all things desire. The good is that which all things desire. So we always act seeking an end. There's some end of our behavior. There's something that we're doing something for some reason. There's an end. Then he goes on to say, of ends, there are two different kinds. So there are two different kinds of ends, and make sure you understand this. There are two different kinds of ends, two different kinds of things that we do and seek. Some of them are called energies, and some of them are called works. Some ends are called energies, some ends are called works. An energy is something we do for its own sake, something that we do and the action stays with us. So for example, singing is an example of an energy. We sing for the sake of singing, or thinking or studying. We study to gain knowledge. It stays with us. It's in us. We study for the sake of studying. Exercise is like this. If we understand exercise rightly, we exercise simply because it's good to exercise. It's healthy to exercise. We exercise for the sake of the action itself. So that's what an energy is. It's an action that where the end of the action is the action itself. All right. So that's an energy. The end of the action is the action itself. And then there are also works. Works are products. Works are things that we do. So the action leads to some product. So for example, cooking, right? Baking. You go and you're working and you're doing all this work in the kitchen. What is the end of this activity? It's a cake, right? That it's a dinner. That's the end. It's a work. Or a carpenter is working, he's measuring and cutting and putting things together. What is the end of his activity? The end is he's building a deck or he's building a shed or something like that. So there are two different kinds of ends. Sometimes the end is an action itself. Sometimes the end is some product that's produced by the action. So make sure you understand that. Two different kinds of ends. There are things we do just for the sake of doing them. And there are other things we do in order to produce something else besides the action, two different kinds of ends. Okay, very, very simple concept, but the words that he uses, energies and works, usually causes students some confusion, and it's really a very simple concept, all right? It's a little confusing to think about sometimes because we don't really know, like, am I doing this action for the sake of the action, or am I doing it for some work? Sometimes it's not so clear, right? Like, for example, if I say, well, what's the end of exercise? You might say, I want big muscles. So are those big muscles, are they a work? Is that a product that's produced, or is it part of the action? So sometimes it's not so clear, right? But I want you to at least get the basic idea that energies are actions where the end is an action itself. It stays with us. And a work is an action that is a work is an end where the action produces something outside of us, okay? Energies and works. So two important concepts. Moving on here, he says, in those things in which there are certain ends besides the actions, there are certain ends besides the actions, in these, the works are better than the energies. So for example, and this is kind of confusing as well. If let's say, mom and dad hire some carpenters to come to the house to build a new porch or something. And so you're sitting there and you're watching, and these carpenters show up and they get to work, and you're watching them work for a couple of days, and they're working and working and working. And then when they're done, you've got a new porch. What's more important? What's greater, the porch or the action of working to build the porch? What's greater? The answer is the porch is greater, okay? The product or the end is greater than the action because the action is done for the sake of the end. The end is more important. The end is more valuable. And to think about it in an easier way, just think about money, right? Money itself is not valuable. We want money because we want to do things with the money. I would like to have some money so I can buy myself some new clothes, or so I can take a trip to the beach and spend a couple $100 on some vacation time. We want money not as an end in itself. We want money for some other thing. So money is usually inferior to lots of other things. Money is a means to an end. Actions that we perform, they're often only valuable because they bring about some end. They bring about some product or some work or something like that. But the ends are more valuable. They're more important than the actions themselves, because if it wasn't for the end, we wouldn't do those actions. The only reason we do them is to get the end. So the ends are actually more important. They're more valuable than the actions themselves, okay? Now, since Aristotle says, since there are many different actions, many different human actions, we could just list them for hours and hours and hours, many, many different activities, many different things that people do voluntarily. Everything from dancing to singing to cleaning to cooking to building, praying, studying, crying, all of these different things that human beings do. There must also be many different ends, all right? Since there's so many different actions and all of these actions have an end, then there must be lots of different ends as well, because all of these actions have ends. So there must be lots and lots of different ends. And Aristotle gives us a few examples. For example, The end of medicine, the study of medicine or the practice of medicine, the end is health. We go to the doctor not because it's cool to go to the doctor, not because we like the doctor. We go to the doctor usually because we're sick and we would like him to help us to get back to health. We want health. That's what we want. Yeah, I know. I'm not picking on doctors. I used to like my doctors when I was a kid too. I had a doctor. He was a Greek. His name was Dr. Halavopoulos, and we used to call him Dr. Hippopotamus. He was our doctor when we were growing up. We loved him. So I mean, good doctors are great, but we don't go to the doctor. Our parents don't bring us there because it's fun to go to the doctor. We go there either because we're sick or because we need a physical to participate in some activity, or we need, a vaccine or something else. We need something. So we go to the doctor because we're seeking health. That's what we're seeking. We're seeking health, or we're seeking permission to play a sport or something like that. The end of medicine is health. It's not going to the doctor itself. It's not practicing medicine itself. There's something else that we seek. Shipbuilding, the end of shipbuilding is a ship, right? We judge a shipbuilder not by his talk about shipbuilding or because he writes books about shipbuilding. We talk about shipbuilding because we want a ship, and we judge a shipbuilder by the ship that he produces, all right? The end of the art of shipbuilding is a ship. Military art, the end of the military art is victory. So we judge a general by whether or not he wins. That's what the general is supposed to do. We judge his wisdom in battle by whether he reaches the end of battle, which is victory. Okay, so all of these different actions have ends. The end of economics, we study the art of economics, not because it's cool to study economics, but because we want to gain wealth. So the end of the economic art would be wealth. So there's all different kinds of activities, all different kinds of actions, and all of these actions have different ends, all different kinds of ends that are sought. So when you say like, well, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a nurse, I want to be an architect, I want to be a priest, I want to be this or that. What you're really talking about is not what you want to be. You really don't want to be a doctor. You really don't want to be, you want the end that action serves. That's what you're really thinking about. So for some people, the end of the work that they talk about is they just want to make money. So they might say, I want to be a doctor. But if you ask them, like, for what end? What is the end for which you want to be a doctor? And they might say, well, I want to have money and I want to be a member of the country club, so I'd like to become a doctor so I can make a lot of money and I can play golf and hang out with my buddies and talk to the other doctors and enjoy a nice, cultured life. Well, that's really not the end of the medical profession, right? The end of the medical profession is to make people well, to try to lead people to health. So that's really not a good motivation to become a doctor. And I always talk to students about this stuff because I'll talk to teenage students about their vocational plans and stuff like that, and they'll always try to pretend like they're so honorable and virtuous. Like they'll say, well, I think I want to be a doctor because I like to help people. I want to take care of sick people. And I'll say to them, well, Mother Teresa took care of sick people. You don't need to be a doctor to take care of sick people. So don't say, I want to be a doctor because I want to take care of sick people, because you don't need to go to medical school to take care of sick people. You could be a Franciscan monk and take care of sick people. You could be a missionary of charity and take care of sick people. Becoming a doctor is not for the sake of taking care of sick people. There's more to it, right? So when we talk about vocations and career plans and things like that, it's good for us to understand this talk about ends and actions, because we really need to ask ourselves, what is the end that I desire? And what's the best way to pursue that end? And we can't lie about it. We can't pretend we're doing something because of this, because you don't necessarily have to do that to have that end. You say, well, I want to go to college. I want to study music. I want to I want to go to Hollywood and because I want to play. Well, you don't need to go to Hollywood to play music, right? So don't associate these actions with these ends when they really don't connect to each other. So it's good for us to think about that stuff. All right. Actions and ends, lots of different actions, lots of different ends. But what we really need to think about is, what are people really seeking? What are the ends that they're really seeking? Like if mom's in the kitchen preparing dinner, what is she really trying to accomplish? Is she just trying to get food on the table? Because there's a million ways to do that, right? She could just go to the store and buy like a box of oatmeal and just toss it on the table, throw some plastic spoons and paper bowls on the table and say, there, dinner is served, food's on the table. And, if the end was just feeding the family, well, she could do that with some oatmeal, right? So when you see her cooking and she's got all these different recipe ingredients and she's got all these spices and seasonings and she's got the table set for dinner and all this kind of stuff, you can see that there's some other end. The end that for which she's preparing dinner is not just to feed the family like you're a bunch of cattle and it's feeding time. There's something more. There's more to that action. The end is not just to get people food, okay? There's lots of other ends, like it's a time for family time together. It's a social activity. She wants to make it pleasant. She wants to make it healthy. She wants to make it taste good. So you eat your broccoli and you don't just eat the potatoes and push the broccoli off the plate. There's a lot of complicated ends in different activities, and it's important for us to understand them so that we can make sure that we do things for the right reasons and actually achieve the ends. So lots of different ends for these actions. Okay. Now, what's also important to think about, and follow me here, don't get distracted by chat, because we got to keep this thought developing. Aristotle is leading us step by step to this thought that he wants us to understand in chapter 1. Lots of different actions, lots of different voluntary human actions. They all have different ends. They're all being done for some reason. The different ends cause the actions to be, some of them are important and superior to others. Some ends are greater than others. For example, he gives us an example here. Bridle making. You know what bridle making? It means making like equipment for horses, right? So imagine if you're the man who makes bridles. So you're sitting in your shop and you've got your leather and your tools and your different buckles and straps and all the stuff that you use, and you're making bridles. What are you making bridles for? Answer that for me. What are you making horse bridles for? And don't say money, because that's really not the answer. You're making horse bridles to serve a person who's riding a horse. Very good, okay? The end of that task, the end of the bridle making, is to allow a person to ride a horse. So what's more noble, riding a horse or making a horse bridle? Which is more noble? Which is more excellent? Riding a horse or making a horse bridle? Riding the horse is more excellent, because if we don't ride horses, we don't need horse bridles. The man who makes the horse bridles depends on the man who rides the horse. And the man who rides the horse tells the bridle maker how the bridle needs to be made, because it needs to be made for the horse rider. And so you can see now, these aren't equal activities. We don't have bridle making and that's equal to horse riding. That's not true. Horse riding is above bridle making, and bridle making serves horse riding. Now, we look at horse riding and we ask, well, what's the purpose of horse riding? And we can say, well, there's lots of different purposes of horse riding. Some people ride horses just for exercise. It's a form of exercise. Monica just said some people ride horses as a way of transportation. Some people ride horses because horses are used in war. So how we ride a horse is determined by the end that we're seeking by horse riding. So The bridle maker is subject to the horse rider. But if that horse rider is a soldier, what is the end of the horse riding? Who can tell me that? What is the end of the horse riding if the horse rider is a soldier? It's to actually serve his part in the army, right? Who determines what the horse rider should do? Who determines what the horse rider should do or how he should ride his horse? Who determines that? The horse rider? Does he decide? His commander, right? Whoever is his superior determines what he should do. So the general commands the horse rider commands the bridle maker. So what we see, what Aristotle wants us to see, is that different actions serve different ends, but all of these different ends are related to each other in different ways. And so there's a hierarchy. There's an order of ends. There's a hierarchy of ends. And I just want to write that just to make sure that you know what I'm saying and see the word. There's a hierarchy of ends. So it's not all equal. It's not all equal. Like we like to talk all this equality nonsense today. We like to say like, oh, well, if you're a cook in the restaurant, you're just as important as the manager of the That's not true. That's ridiculous. The manager of the restaurant tells the cook what to do. The cook does what the manager, the whole end of the cook's work is to serve the desire or the instructions of the master. There's a hierarchy. Now, when we talk about equality, what we mean, but it's not communicated clearly. What we mean is it's important for us to have cooks, and it's important for us to have managers. They're both necessary, but they're not equal, right? That's why the manager can fire the cook. They're not equal. The cook can't fire the manager. The manager is in control of the cook because we can get another cook. The manager can get rid of the cook. So you see, there's a hierarchy of ends, okay? The manager can live without the cook. The cook cannot live without the manager. The manager can get new cooks. Very good, okay? Now, so we've got to understand what we mean. When we say that all people are equal, we mean that you should respect everybody, right? So if you pull up at a fast food restaurant and there's a person working at the fast food restaurant, you shouldn't say, oh, what are you doing, you loser? You know, look at you work at a fast food restaurant. That's disrespectful because all of the parts of society are important. Everybody's got different roles to play. We played different roles at different times. You know, there was a time when I was in college, I worked at Starbucks when I was in college. I used to make drinks at Starbucks as a college student. So if you were to go up to that kid working at Starbucks and say, what are you doing, you loser? Why don't you get a real job? Well, it's like, well, chill out. I'm 20 years old. I'm in college. Now, this is a real job for a guy who's in college. So you see that there's different times of our life, there's different phases of our lives, and we serve different roles at different times. And usually we start at the bottom and we work our way up to some place where we have our, you know, our final work in life. Yeah. Well, I'm just saying, like, I was a Starbucks worker. So, you know, I would go on to become the founder and director of an educational program. But when I was 19, 20 years old, the people there just saw me as the guy who works the morning shift at Starbucks and makes coffee for people. So you can see that these roles that we have in society, they don't define who we are. They don't define what we are. It's just roles that we play at different times in our life. They're all important, but they're not all equal. That's dumb to say they're all equal. They're important, but they're not equal, all right? Nobody needs to drink coffee in the first place, or at least Starbucks coffee. It's you know, it's a luxury, okay? So anyway, the point is, the important point Aristotle's making is that actions serve ends, and there's a ranking or a hierarchy of ends. Some ends are better than others. They're more important, they're more excellent than others. And so we see there's some ends that are all the way down at the bottom of this hierarchy. And as we go up, we reach higher and higher ends. Now, the bridle maker's work is determined by the end of horse riding. The horse rider determines how the bridle should be made. So the bridle maker has to know about horse riding so that he can make the bridle the right way. The horse rider, his attention is on the general because he has to know how to ride his horse, because his horse riding serves the end of whatever the battle strategy is that's determined by the general. So his attention is on the general. He has to know what the general wants so that he can go concentrate on doing it. And we see there's a hierarchy as we go up. The general, his attention is on somebody else because the general's not really in charge. He's in charge of the army, but he himself is subject to the king or to the president in America. Okay, that's enough with coffee. So there's a hierarchy of ends. There's a hierarchy of ends, and that also means there's a hierarchy of actions. Now, if we see that there's a hierarchy of ends, what question should we ask? If there's a hierarchy of ends, what question do you think that we should ask? What question you think should ask? Very good, Lara. If there's a hierarchy, what is the highest end? What is the highest end? Because ultimately, the bridle maker needs to think about the highest end. The horse rider needs to think about the highest end. The general needs to think about the highest end. The king needs to think about the highest end. Everyone needs to think about the highest end. So the knowledge of the highest end is important to everybody. Everybody needs to know what the highest end is. So if I were to ask you, what is the highest end of your life? What is the highest end of your life? What do you think the answer might be? What do you think the highest end of human action is? Of all human action, any human action, what do you think the highest end might be? The salvation of the soul to get to heaven. Aristotle would say you're wrong. That's not the highest end. And this is going to surprise everybody. Nope. Aristotle would say, all of you got it wrong. All of you got it wrong. No, he would criticize your answers and he would be right. All of you are wrong. The goal is not to get your own soul to heaven. That's not the highest goal. There's another higher goal than that. The highest goal is to get everyone's soul to heaven. That's the highest end, right? Everyone's good, okay? So certainly is, one of the highest ends to save your own soul, right? To get to heaven. That's one of the highest ends, but that is not the highest end. The highest end is to also help your neighbor get to heaven, okay? So there's a higher end than just getting yourself to heaven. And if you think about it, that is exactly what Jesus taught us. Do any of you know what the Great Commission is? Anybody know what the Great Commission is? Just say no if you don't. I'll explain it. I'm just curious. Does anybody know what the Great Commission is? The Great Commission, yeah, that's right. George is kind of getting there. The Great Commission is the mission of the Christian church that Jesus gave the church before he ascended into heaven. He said, I'm just going to type it so you can see the word, Great Commission. Jesus said at the end of the gospel, I think it's the end of Matthew, I think it's Matthew chapter 28. That's right, George. He said, go into all the nations, baptize them. He said, go and make disciples, baptize them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and teach them to obey all that I've commanded you. So the mission of the church is not for individual Christians to save their own soul. That's not the chief end. The chief end is actually to save your own soul, but also to love your neighbor and help save your neighbor's soul as well. That's the chief end, okay? That determines everything we do. So if you're a cook working at McDonald's, your thoughts should be on the highest and most excellent end, how you treat other people. no matter what your role is in society, everything you do, whether you're the bridle maker or the horse rider or the general or the king, no matter what your role is, you should be thinking about your highest end or the highest end of human life. And you should be asking if what you're doing is serving that highest end, or if the way that you're doing it is serving the highest end. And if you don't know that highest end, like you all got wrong when I asked you, if you don't know what the highest end is, it's hard for you to focus your life and know what you should be doing. It's hard for you to make decisions. It's hard for you to decide, is this good or bad? So when you say, hey, Mr. Michael, is it okay for me to read Harry Potter books? What's the answer to that question? Well, what's your highest end? That's how you answer the question, okay? That's the answer to the question. Start with the highest end and then come down to the specific question and ask whether you should do this or how you should do it and so on. If you say, well, I need some money, and what I've decided to do to make money is, I can get this really cheap junk from, this website that sells stuff from China, and I can go sell it to my neighbors and tell them that it's good, and they all like it because it looks good, and I can sell them this stuff that I pay $1 for. I can sell it for $100 to each of these people because they don't know where I got it from. Well, your end might be to make money and you might succeed in that end, but the problem is your end is not in line with the highest end, and that's what makes it immoral. You see what I mean? It's not that making money is immoral, but the way that you're making money does not serve the highest end, and therefore it is immoral. So there's no way for us to make moral decisions unless we understand what the highest end is and then focus everything on that highest end. Well, Lara, that's how business works, right? I mean, that's what retail is. When you go to a retail clothes store, that store is buying stuff cheap and they're marking up all the prices and they're making you buy it for more money. And that's a moral question, right? Should the store do that? How much can the store mark it up? Can the store mark it up a lot? What happens? Let's say there's a hurricane and all the power goes out and nobody has any heating, and the hardware store sells kerosene and sells gas heaters, and the hardware store chooses to sell the heaters for $1,000 each because everybody's going to freeze to death unless they buy a heater. Is it okay for the hardware store to do that? Well, that's a complicated moral question, you see? So yes, the hardware store is in the business of selling things to make profit, but the owner of the hardware store has to consider whether the way that he goes about that is actually in line with the highest end. And what will happen? What will happen to that hardware store? Let's say you've got this problem, there's this terrible storm, everyone's desperate, you choose to jack up all the prices on the heaters. Will the people buy the heaters during that emergency? Will they buy those heaters? Will the people buy those heaters? Yes or no? I don't think they'll freeze to death. They will buy them. They'll have no choice. And so they will buy them. But will that hardware store prosper? What's going to happen to that hardware store? What's going to happen to that hardware store? People will buy the heaters because they have no choice. But what's going to happen? Well, they may gain money, but what's going to happen is eventually that place is going to recover from that storm, and they're never going to buy from that hardware store again. And so that attempt to make money during that bad time, to try to take advantage of the people, that's going to come back to hurt that hardware store and possibly put them out of business. So you can see those moral decisions, it's very complicated how to figure out what to do, how to decide how much to charge, how much profit to try to make, and so on. You've really got to consider the good of your neighbors because your reputation is going to allow you to make a lot more money in the long run than trying to take advantage of them in this one difficult situation. So you can see that understanding the real end of your work and realizing that all your neighbors understand the end as well, and that they're going to judge you by that end, not by how much money you make. These are moral decisions that need to be made. And what we find in life is that those who make good moral decisions ultimately enjoy the most happiness, the most prosperity. Sometimes it's material prosperity. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just happiness. Sometimes it's good for you to accept a humble place in the world because it's happy and good. Other times it's your duty to accept a higher calling because it's also good. I'll give you a good example. There's a movie that you should watch. Of course, you should get your parents' permission, but it's a good movie. Some of you may have already seen it. It's called A Man for All Seasons. It's the story of the life of Thomas More, St. Thomas More. The title of the movie is A Man for All Seasons. You should watch it because in that movie, Thomas More is a saint. He's the main character. Okay. It's a great movie, but in that movie, Thomas More is a very powerful man. St. Thomas More was the second most powerful man in England. He was the Chancellor of England. He was under only the king. He was the king's right-hand man. St. Thomas was very powerful. He was a lawyer. And he had a man that he was an acquaintance with whose name was Richard Rich. That was his name, Richard Rich. And Richard Rich asked St. Thomas what kind of work he should do. Right? He asked St. Thomas what kind of work he should do. And St. Thomas told Richard Rich that he should be a teacher. That's what he told him. Richard Rich wanted Thomas More to help him become wealthy and powerful and famous. But Thomas More refused to help Richard Rich. He told him that he should be a teacher. He told Richard Rich that he should be a teacher because Richard Rich was not a moral man. And Thomas More knew that if Richard Rich got into Thomas More's kind of work, he would not be able to handle the temptations. He wouldn't be able to handle bribes and things like that. And he knew that helping Richard Rich to become more influential would actually be bad for Richard Rich. And so he told Richard Rich to be a teacher. And the lesson there is that it would have been better for Richard Rich to be a humble teacher than to try to become an influential statesman or a great lawyer or something like that. So sometimes, based on our own character, based on our own strengths and weaknesses, it may be better for us to stay in a humble place where we're safe. But sometimes, however, you may have strengths that other people need, and you may actually wish you could stay in a humble place, but you're called to accept a more difficult place, and it's your moral duty to accept it. That's what happens to saints in most of the lives of the saints. They get called into higher positions because they're so valuable, they're wise and they're good, and people want them to be in charge. And the saints try to get out of it. They don't want to be in charge. They want to just be left alone where they're safe. So sometimes you need to take a low position to be happy. Sometimes you need to accept a higher position to be happy. What determines that is the end of everything, okay? So there's different ends. Now, to be quick here, I want to get through this. There's a word in this chapter called, this word architectonic. It's this big fancy word. When one art is higher than another art, like the military art is higher than horse riding and higher than bridle making, that higher art is called architectonic. Architectonic, and you can see it here, it means master art. So an art that's higher, an art that's superior to another art is called a master art. It's said to be architectonic. So the military art is architectonic with respect to horse riding. Horse riding is architectonic with respect to bridle making. The military art is architectonic with respect to horse riding and to bridle making and to anything else under it. So that's what that word architectonic means. And like you guys said, the question that we want to ask is, what is the highest art? That's what we have to figure out. Now, I kind of gave it away by asking you and talking about it. And Aristotle's not a Christian, not because he rejects Christianity, but because he lived before Christianity. And Aristotle, in chapter 2, we're going to read that Aristotle says that the highest art is political science or politics. And when you hear that, usually modern people are like, that's not right. Politics is not the highest end. But remember, go back to Aristotle's time. We're not talking about Christianity. We're not talking about the Christian church or any of that stuff. We're talking about pre-Christian society. Let me ask you this. We haven't studied the chapter yet. Maybe you're already on that lesson. I don't know. But I asked you, what's the highest end? You said to get to heaven. I said, you're wrong. And the reason why is because it's more noble to help bring other people to heaven, not just to save yourself. So it's more complicated than that. You might think, well, the highest goal in life, if I was Aristotle, I would say the highest goal in life is to be a good person. To be a good person, that's the highest end in life. And Aristotle would say, no, that's not the highest end in life. Politics is the highest end in life. Why do you think Aristotle would say that? Why would Aristotle say, no, being a good person is not the highest end? Political science is the highest. That's right, James. Very good. That's right. Good. All right. Because it's not just your own good that you're responsible for. It's not just your selfish good. And you see how we think, right? It's not just your good. It's the good also of the people around you. You know, you might say, well, not just my good, but also my family. No, not just your family. Okay, well, not just my good, but also my family and also my friends. No, not just your friends. You're responsible to seek the common good, the good of everyone. That's the chief end. That's more noble than you seeking a good life for yourself. Your good life is just a part of that. So the end is actually higher. And so to summarize chapter 1 here and finish up, what Aristotle is teaching us is that all voluntary human actions are done for some purpose, okay? They have an end. There's a hierarchy of ends. All of these actions are not as important as others. There's a hierarchy of ends. Once we realize there's a hierarchy of ends, reason should lead us to ask, well, what's the highest end? And identifying the highest end is very important because it gives us a target to aim at in our lives. It gives everyone a target to aim at. And so that the purpose of chapter 1 is for Aristotle to lead us to this point where we're thinking about what is that highest end. That's the question that he wanted to lead us to in chapter 1. And in chapter 2, we're going to get to his answer of what the highest end is. You guys already understand that. It's pretty clear. You guys did pretty well with that, but you did get it wrong. So I can't give you too much credit because you didn't get it right. You might know it now, but you didn't know it then. And you can see if you were to go and ask your parents or ask your siblings or ask your grandparents or maybe even ask your priest and were to say, what is the highest end in human life? If any of them were to say, whoa, well, the highest end is to save your soul. No, that's not right, right? That's not right. That's not the highest end. The highest end is not to save your own soul. The highest end is to try to help your neighbor save his soul as well, right? And that changes everything. So it's that kind of assumption that we know the answer that philosophy usually reveals to us. We're all wrong. It's not just to save your own soul. And notice when we ask questions about like, is it okay for me to do this? Is it okay for me to do that? Is it sin for me to, do this? What's wrong with the question that we ask is you're not just responsible for saving your own soul. You're also responsible for the effects that your behavior has on other people. So it's not that simple. So for example, I work hard, I pay my family's bills. Isn't it okay for me to go sit on the couch in the living room, grab a beer, put my feet up, and spend 4 hours watching a football game on a Saturday night? Isn't it okay for me to do that? The answer is actually not that simple. It doesn't matter that I worked during the day or that I also have to think, how will my behavior affect other people? Is it the best thing that I could do? Is it good for other people to see me do this? Is there something else I should be doing? It's not just about whether something is sinful for me as an individual or whether it's okay or whether I deserve it. I'm also responsible to ask myself whether what I'm doing is the best thing that I could do for others as well, because I'm responsible to my neighbor, not just for my own salvation. So we're making good progress. That's chapter 1 of Aristotle's Ethics. You can see how he's starting to stir us up to ask some questions and think about these things. We're going to get into all this stuff in very great detail. So even if we've talked about some topics, I'm kind of getting ahead of us because we're going to go through all this stuff in detail. So don't feel too bad that you got the answer wrong. You don't have to walk around with your head bowed down in shame today for the rest of the day. We haven't studied it yet. So we're going to get through all this stuff as we study ethics, and this is going to be really clear. And like I said, I think you're going to really appreciate this class because it's very helpful. So that's all for today. Chapter 1 of Book 1 of Aristotle's Ethics. Study the lesson for yourself if you haven't already, and make sure you get these assignments done. It's good to get them done while we're talking about them because you've got these ideas fresh in your head. So go read the lesson, get the assignments done, and we'll move through this together. And if you're already ahead of these lessons, we'll probably catch up to you because you probably won't move faster than the class does. We'll probably catch up, but even as we go through it, just pay attention in case there's something that you missed, or maybe I explain something and it becomes clearer, or it leads to a question, or there's something you want to ask about. So these live classes are helpful anyway, but I hope that's helpful. We'll continue this study together and work through Aristotle's Ethics. So thanks for joining me. I'm going to turn the recording off now, and then if there's anything you want to talk about, feel free to ask. Let me just turn the recording off first.